He was the Lion of Christendom, the Sword of Europe, the son of a queen and the nemesis of Saladin. His name, Richard, was carved into the bones of medieval history like thunder etched into stone. But on one night, in one quiet chamber, he did something no Crusader king was supposed to do. He shared a bed with another man, and not just any man, Philip II of France, Richard's greatest political rival, his fiercest continental equal, and possibly something else entirely. What were they doing there, alone in the soft glow of candlelight? No servants, no scribes, no thrones or swords between them. What began as an act of diplomacy, two kings resting under one canopy, has echoed through centuries of uncertain silence. Historians have debated it, chroniclers danced around it, and generation after generation was taught not to ask the one question that could unravel the way we see courage, kingship, and masculinity itself. What if Richard the Lionheart loved Philip of France? The night no one wanted to remember. It happened sometime before the Third Crusade, in a Europe bristling with tension and theological fervor. France and England, eternal enemies, briefly became allies. To mark their newfound union, Richard and Philip met in Paris and performed an act meant to display trust, loyalty, and brotherhood. They slept in the same bed. In medieval tradition, bed sharing among men wasn't always sexual. It could be political theater, a symbolic way to show, I will not stab you in the night. But Richard and Philip didn't just sleep in the same bed once. According to multiple contemporary sources, they shared living quarters, meals, and sleeping arrangements for months. Roger of Howden, an English chronicler writing in Richard's own lifetime, reported with barely concealed discomfort, every day they ate at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. That last line wasn't poetic. It was a problem. Because this wasn't a knight and his squire, nor a boy and his tutor. These were two sovereign rulers, two embodiments of Christian manhood, and they chose, again and again, to be seen together in a closeness that defied royal decorum. When symbols begin to bleed at first glance, it was diplomacy. Two young kings uniting against a common enemy. Richard, fiery proud, and the son of a legendary queen. Philip, shrewd, analytical, and already skilled in palace politics. Together they were a spectacle, and a problem. For the men who chronicled them, their bond wasn't just unusual, it was unsettling. How does one write about two kings so publicly entangled without suggesting what no one dared to say? Some wrote around it, others wrote nothing. A few let the facts slip through, hoping history would do the rest. But history didn't forget. It hesitated. It blinked. It passed the story on with a whisper. Why this changes everything, we're not here to reduce two monarchs to a bedroom scene. We're here because if Richard, the icon of knightly virtue, had an emotional or romantic connection to another man, then it challenges almost every heroic mold we've ever inherited. It means masculinity can include softness. It means kingship doesn't require heterosexual certainty. It means a man can be both lion-hearted and vulnerable, powerful and tender. And it forces us to ask what else we've erased. Not because it wasn't true, but because it made us uncomfortable. A different kind of courage we call Richard, the Lionheart, because of his battlefield prowess, his unshakable will, his fearless presence before the gates of Jerusalem. But what if the greater courage lay in something more private, more hidden? Not every warrior's strength is measured in steel. Sometimes it's measured in what they risk carrying, quietly, invisibly, under the weight of a crown. What Richard carried, we may never fully know. But one night, he chose to share his bed with another king, and that choice, buried beneath armor and chronicles and centuries of silence, still speaks. Not as scandal, not as spectacle, but as a secret that history wasn't brave enough to name until now. Rome, winter of 1195. A cloaked man enters a chamber carved of cold marble and candlelight. He kneels, not in armor, but in silence. No trumpet announces him, no herald sings his name, and yet the man before the Pope is no ordinary pilgrim. He is Richard, the Lionheart, the hammer of the Saracens, the crowned son of Europe's most powerful queen. He has conquered cities and crossed deserts. He has stood at the gates of Acre, drenched in blood and holy purpose. But now, in this private moment, he is not a crusader, not a king. He is a soul burdened by something unspeakable. And then, he says it, quietly, "I have committed carnal sins. That's all." He doesn't elaborate, doesn't offer names, doesn't tell stories. But he doesn't have to, because in the church's language, especially in the 12th century, those three words are a dagger. Carnal sins didn't mean pride, didn't mean wrath. It meant desire, it meant flesh, and it almost never meant a woman. The silence that followed, the Pope listens. Perhaps he already knows. Perhaps he has heard whispers. Perhaps he, too, knows how politics and piety often sleep uneasily in the same bed. But the Pope does not ask for details. He does not demand penance. There is no fiery rebuke, no proclamation of heresy, only stillness. The Church accepts Richard's confession, but never records the sin. No one ever names it. And in that blank space where a name should have been, where a sin should have been carved into stone, something else begins to grow: speculation. The kind that lingers longer than fact. Why this confession matters: Richard wasn't just any sinner. He wasn't some back alley baron begging forgiveness before battle. He was Christendom's golden sword. He was the banner behind which thousands had marched, slaughtered, died. And if he had loved, or even desired, someone the Church did not approve of, then the very foundation of his legend of the Crusades, of masculine sanctity itself, began to tremble. So the Church did the only thing it could: it turned the other cheek. It accepted the confession and buried the sin. Not forgiven, not condemned, just buried. But history has a way of unburying what matters most. What happened after leaving the Vatican? Richard returned to the world not as a man humbled, but as a king returned. And just days later he would once again stand beside the man he had once shared a bed with, Philip II of France. Philip, whose alliance had been forged not just in treaty but in touch. Philip, who would later back Richard's rebellion against his own father. Philip, whose name kept appearing in the margins of Richard's story. Always too close, always too familiar. Was it love? Was it guilt? Was it political theater gone too far? We don't know. But we do know this: Richard confessed when he didn't have to. He had survived imprisonment, survived war, survived the Third Crusade. He could have carried the truth to his grave. But something, whether fever, fear, or fatigue, drove him to admit a sin the Church refused to name. The power of what's left unsaid. If he had named a woman, we would have her name. If he had named a prostitute or a scandal, it would have been written in fire. But he didn't. And the omission is louder than any proclamation. Because the greatest sins in the eyes of power are not always the ones that are committed, but the ones that can't be spoken aloud. Richard's silence became his loudest act. His brief confession, a rupture in the script of sainthood, a moment where the crown slipped and revealed a man beneath it. And maybe that's what scared them most. Not that he sinned, but that his sin made him human. Not a confession of weakness, but of truth. There's something deeply modern in Richard's ancient moment. A man of immense power, kneeling in a sacred room, confessing what no scroll would preserve. In that moment, he wasn't fighting for cities or titles. He wasn't representing England or Christ. He was, perhaps for the first time, fighting only for his soul. It wasn't a political calculation. It wasn't even a plea for forgiveness. It was a risk. And like all real risks, it left a scar that no history book dared fully trace. The year was 1187. Paris shimmered with winter light. Inside the Capetian court, firelight glowed across stone columns, and goblets clinked beneath painted ceilings. Outside, the streets hummed with the tension of a world always on the brink of war. But within the great hall, something unprecedented was happening, something that no one, not even the court chroniclers, knew quite how to describe. England and France, rivals by blood, by crown, by generations of war, had for a moment become allies, and not through parchment or papal pressure, but through two men, Richard of England, Philip of France, kings. Young, brilliant, charismatic, and, it seemed, inseparable. That night they feasted side by side, toasted from the same cup, and according to more than one account, when the embers dimmed and the guests had gone, they lay in the same bed. At night, Their beds did not separate them. That's not hearsay. That's from Roger of Howden, one of the most respected chroniclers of the era, and a man not given to exaggeration. He wrote, "They ate every day at the same table, from the same dish, and at night, their beds did not separate them." That line has echoed through centuries of archival silence. Because it wasn't written as metaphor. It wasn't embellished with flowery allegory. It was a statement of fact presented without judgment, and that, perhaps, made it more dangerous. Two kings, one bed, not once, not twice, but night after night. And in the Middle Ages that meant something. The meaning of a shared bed in the medieval world, bed sharing wasn't always romantic. Nobles and knights sometimes shared sleeping space to show trust, to display equality, or simply due to space limitations. But this was different. This wasn't two travelers in a crowded inn. This was royalty in palaces, in front of witnesses, in a world obsessed with appearances. And it wasn't one night, it was months. Their closeness extended to public rituals, matching garments, joint declarations of loyalty. Even their feasts were ceremonial shows of unity. To the outside world, they presented as more than allies, more than friends. They were a vision of union, one that blurred the lines between diplomacy and something deeper. The court whispered. The church listened. Of course, people noticed. Nobles gossiped behind goblets of wine. Courtiers spoke in half-sentences and sideways glances. And behind cathedral walls, the clergy began to murmur. The closeness between Richard and Philip didn't just raise eyebrows, it raised questions. Not only about morality, but about control. Because if two kings could forge such a bond outside the confines of dynastic marriage, church authority, or tradition, what else could be defied? Even Richard's own father, King Henry VI, accused Philip of bewitching his son. It was an accusation wrapped in metaphor, but sharpened with meaning. He wasn't talking about magic, he was talking about influence, about devotion, about love, or something dangerously close to it. A union that shifted empires, whatever it was between Richard and Philip. It wasn't just emotional, it was political dynamite. Their alliance threatened to unite England and France in a way that would have redrawn the entire map of Europe. For a time, the two kings stood together as a single, terrifying force. They rebelled against Henry II. They coordinated campaigns. Their decisions reverberated from Normandy to Rome. And when the alliance later fractured, it left behind more than broken treaties. It left heartbreak, jealousy, betrayal. Philip would never again speak of Richard with the same warmth. And when Richard turned his attention elsewhere, toward marriage and military glory, something in their connection faded. But the world remembered, because the world had seen. Was it love? We may never know what passed between them behind closed doors. There are no letters that survive, no confessions, no poems or diaries. But what we do have is the reaction, the discomfort of chroniclers, the accusations of fathers, the whispers in cathedrals, the silence of the church. Powerful men do not inspire that kind of fear unless they're crossing a line. And maybe the real line wasn't in the bed. Maybe it was in the heart. Spring of 1191. The Mediterranean breeze brushed across white silk banners as a royal wedding began. Not in England, not in France, but on the distant island of Cyprus. Richard, the Lionheart, was getting married. Berengaria of Navarre, daughter of King Sancho VI, stepped from her ship in shimmering white, dignified, soft-spoken, and virtuous. She was the perfect bride. The ceremony was swift, political, dignified. Richard wore armor, she wore a crown. But the wedding night came, and they did not sleep together. The marriage with no heir in medieval Europe, heirs weren't just expected, they were required. Royal weddings weren't about romance. They were contracts for bloodlines, treaties sealed in flesh. But Richard and Berengaria never had children. Not one. Heirs were the currency of kings. A dynasty without a future was a kingdom in crisis. And yet Richard, warrior, strategist, ruler, seemed completely unbothered. No mistresses, no illegitimate sons hidden in the countryside, no concubines, no scandals, no heirs. Just silence. The queen in the shadows. Berengaria would rarely see her husband again. After their wedding, Richard left for the Holy Land. She was not invited to follow. She never even stepped foot in England, the kingdom she was technically queen of. She lived her life on the edge of the story, present only in title, not in love. And people noticed. Chroniclers whispered, "Why no hair? Why no intimacy? Was it impotence? Was it piety? Or was it preference? What if Richard married because he had to, but loved someone the church could never allow him to name? The woman who knew only one person likely knew the truth. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard's mother, his strategist, his shield. Eleanor had ruled both France and England. She had defied kings, survived imprisonment, and marched at the head of armies. She was no stranger to secrets, and certainly no stranger to the politics of royal marriage. She arranged Richard's wedding. She negotiated the dowry. She organized the ships. But she expected no child, because she understood something few others could. Some marriages are veils, and some loves must live in silence. A mother's love, silent but unshakable. Eleanor read every letter that passed through her court. She had seen the ones Richard sent to Philip, letters written with warmth, with intimacy, with care beyond diplomacy. She had heard the rumors from Paris that her son shared more than strategy with the King of France. And she had lived long enough to know that kings don't always love their queens. She herself hadn't. She said nothing, but she knew everything. And in her silence, she protected him, not just as a monarch, but as a son. What happens when a throne is empty? With no heir, the Plantagenet line wobbled. Richard's brother John, clever, ambitious, and deeply untrustworthy, waited for his chance to seize the crown. The lack of succession wasn't just personal. It was geopolitical vulnerability. It was a ticking clock. But Richard didn't flinch. He had built his legacy in blood and fire, not in sons. He seemed to believe that what he left behind would be carved in stone, not cradles. And maybe, just maybe, his heart had already given itself to someone history refused to write down. The queen, the bride, and the ghost, 3 women surrounded Richard's life. Only one truly understood him, Berengaria the wife, beautiful, dignified, and alone. History barely remembers her voice. The church crowned her. The world forgot her. But Eleanor remembered everything. And she may have been the only one who ever saw Richard, truly saw him, not as a hero, or a warrior, or a king, but as a son who once loved, and perhaps still did. The truth was once written in Latin. It sat quietly in the margins of old chronicles, on sheepskin vellum, surrounded by red, inked initials and illuminated symbols. It was copied by monks with trembling hands and tired eyes. And then someone decided it had to go. They didn't burn it. They didn't cross it out. They scraped it. The knife and the chronicle in the British Library today. There exists a manuscript, Cotton MS Vespasian AI. If you hold it under angled light, you can see the faint scar where a line was once etched and later removed. Not by accident, not by time, by hand, deliberately, with a penknife. The line once read something like, "And at night, their beds did not divide them." Now it reads nothing at all. Just parchment smooth, blank. History didn't forget. It was edited. Victorian morality, medieval silence. In 1841, an English scholar published a biography of Richard the Lionheart. In his sources, he found the line about bed sharing. He did not explain it. He did not contextualize it. He simply replaced it with a dash. They ate from the same dish and... just that. A typographical wound where a sentence once lived. This wasn't an innocent omission. It was a surgical strike, one aimed at protecting the image of a king the Victorians needed to believe in. Noble, holy, heterosexual. The dash became doctrine, and from there, it echoed into classrooms, pulpits, and parliaments. When legends get polished, history is often taught through statues and stained glass, through films and textbooks, through sanitized heroes that children can recite without questions. And so Richard became a storybook warrior, a crusader on a white horse, a man whose personal life was either too perfect to examine or too shameful to acknowledge. In 1935, Cecil B. DeMille's The Crusades painted Richard as a God-fearing, sword-swinging icon. There were no tender letters, no shared beds, no Queen Eleanor shielding her son's secret, just a king, and his cause, uncomplicated, unquestioned. In 1991, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves brought him back as Sean Connery, appearing for 10 seconds at the end of the film. He smiles, he blesses, he disappears, legacy, sanitized. But the archive still whispers even after centuries of silence, the story refused to die. Modern scholars found the original texts. They examined the parchment scars. They traced the gaps. They asked, why here? Why this line? They weren't asking for confirmation. They were asking for possibility. They weren't demanding Richard be declared queer. They were asking why we were told not to imagine it. What gets lost when we erase intimacy? When we clean up history, we don't just lose salacious detail. We lose the emotional spine of the story. We lose Richard's quiet longing in Crusade camps, Philip's heartbreak when their alliance collapsed, Berengaria's solitude in faraway castles, Eleanor's burden of knowing and protecting and saying nothing. We lose the moments that made Richard human. And maybe, just maybe, that's what frightened the church, the Victorians, and the empire builders the most. Because once you admit a king could love differently, you have to re-examine every story built on his example. The sentence that refuses to stay buried, you can scrape it, you can dash it, you can pretend it was never written. But somewhere, someone will tilt the manuscript into the light and see the truth etched beneath the edits. 2 kings, 1 table, 1 dish, 1 bed. It was never just a sentence. It was a revolution someone tried to erase, and it's still waiting to be read by anyone brave enough to see what was almost forgotten. In the year 1199, Richard died, not in Jerusalem, not in a blaze of glory, but during a minor siege in Limousin, France, a crossbow bolt fired by a peasant. An infection, a slow end. There were no children at his bedside, no lover whispering goodbye, no legacy written in bloodline, just a king, a wound, and silence. No hair, no confession, no goodbye. For a man who carried the banner of Christendom, who led armies across continents, Richard left behind very little. No son to carry his name, no diary, no eulogy from the man who once shared his bed. Berengaria, his queen, never claimed his heart. Philip, his closest ally, his rumored beloved, never wrote of grief. And yet, the legend lived on. In every stained glass cathedral that depicted him with a lion on his chest, in every schoolbook that celebrated his wars but skipped over his confessions, in every play and film that turned him into myth while carving out the human beneath the crown. History isn't what happened, it's what we choose to remember. When we talk about kings, we often talk about their conquests. We list battles, treaties, banners. But what if true power doesn't come from who you defeat, but who you dare to love? What if the most dangerous act a medieval king could commit wasn't rebellion, but tenderness? What if that bed in Paris, where 2 kings lay together under velvet and candlelight, meant more than any alliance ever signed? And what if they did love each other? What if we allowed that possibility to breathe? What would change? We'd stop teaching boys that strength must mean silence. We'd stop erasing the soft parts of men from the pages of greatness. We'd stop turning love into scandal and truth into subtext. And instead, we'd let Richard live, not as a legend, but as a man who carried a sword in one hand and a secret in the other, a man who knelt before a pope, not because he was ashamed of who he was, but because he was trying to survive in a world that had no name for it. In the archive, the line returns somewhere in a library, under cold lights and glass. There is a manuscript, and if you tilt it just right, you'll see a sentence. It was once scraped away, but now it flickers back. And at night, their beds did not divide them. And that's all we ever needed to remember, not to prove anything, not to rewrite history with modern labels, but to say it mattered. That bed mattered. That silence mattered. That love, if it was love, was brave and real and almost lost. The most radical act of all, remembering we will never know all the truth, but we can choose what to carry forward. We can say Richard was a crusader, Richard was a king, and maybe he was also a man who loved. Let that be enough. Let that be the beginning of a different kind of history, one where softness is not weakness, where love is not erased, and where greatness is not always loud. Sometimes the bravest thing a king can do is whisper.